before, it still carries in its cellular memory. It'll go back into its cellular memory until it identifies friend or foe, dangerous or nurturing. Both our nervous system and our immune system is really intimately involved in adaptation, defense, and homeostasis. We're constantly monitoring what's going on around us and adjusting ourselves to maintain inner balance. The immune cells are monitoring both what's going on the outside as well as the inside. Similarly, our nervous system is continuously monitoring the environment for potential challenges as well as internal signals. It allows us to respond to a potentially hostile environment. Immune cells are able to communicate with each other so that a T cell, and we'll talk about this in more detail in just a minute, actually can transmit little tiny packages of information to a B cell telling it, rev it up, we're going into battle. So let's talk about the basic players here. There are several characters in this cast which each have their own particular role but are continuously communicating and interacting with each other. The macrophage, which means big eater, macro, big, phage, eater, is one of the first cells on the scene when something enters our system that we determine shouldn't be there. So if this is a bacteria that could cause us pneumonia if it's not immediately eliminated, then the macrophage gobbles it up. And in its gobbling it up, it breaks it down and it divides it into recognizable packages, which it then displays on its surface. So the macrophage might be the first policeman on the scene. And as soon as it arrives, it assesses the situation, and then the macrophage sends out a message saying, there's something potentially criminal going on here. I'm calling for troops. One of the first troops that arrives is a T cell. The T cell basically reads the information from the macrophage, and as soon as it identifies that something potentially harmful is in the system, it gets revved up and becomes an activated T cell. When it gets revved up, it starts producing more and more of the chemicals that are sending out the information to all the other cells in the immune system. One of the important cells that it sends that information out is a B cell. A B cell is a cell that creates antibodies. And antibodies are like little torpedoes or heat-seeking missiles that once it understands that there's something in the environment that could be potentially harmful, it releases and attaches to the foreign invader that needs to be eliminated. So the macrophage processes the invader, signals to the T cell that it's potentially harmful. The T cell gets revved up, sends these little chemical messengers to the B cell, and the B cell starts sending out these little missiles. And that's really how we fight off viruses, infection, cancer cells. And when it's functioning in a healthy way, it all takes place with us having to even know that it's happening. Now, one of the important cells in this process is called a natural killer cell, or an NK cell. This cell is like a T cell, but it actually connects directly or attaches directly to a bacteria or a cancer cell. And then while it's attached, it secretes these little tiny chemical packages which punch holes in whatever organism it is that we want to eliminate from our system. And as soon as you punch holes in the membrane of an organism, it loses its ability to reproduce. Natural killer cells are particularly important if there are cancer cells that are floating throughout the circulation. It's what protects us from cancer metastasizing to other parts of our body. And we'll be coming back to natural killer cells because it's one of the cells that responds the quickest and the earliest to any changes in our state of mind. Within a few minutes of being stressed, we're in an auto accident, we get a bad diagnosis from a doctor, we come home and we find out that our husband or wife has left us. Within a few moments, actually, the natural killer cell starts to respond to that change in our environment. Now, there are dozens of different chemicals that carry the communication between the mind and the body. There are a number of these different chemicals that are continuously communicating between the mind, the brain, and the immune system. Ones that are commonly heard today are interferon. Interferon is when it's secreted from a cell, it actually enhances the ability for these macrophages to let the rest of the system know that there's something foreign here that needs to be addressed. Interleukins are other types of chemicals which cause the white blood cells to differentiate and become more active in fighting off infection. Tumor necrosis factor is one of the chemicals that the natural killer cell releases when it wants to punch holes in the foreign invader. So there are a number of these different chemicals which are interesting because they're the codes that nature uses to communicate information within the nervous system, within the endocrine system, and within the immune system. Now, this understanding of how the mind communicates to the body has really been going through an evolution since the 1930s. One of the first encounters I had with Walter B. Cannon, who was a great American physiologist, was actually when I was an anthropologist and studied a phenomenon known as voodoo death. It turns out in certain cultures in Africa, if a person violates a major taboo, for example, if you sleep with the king's wife, they don't lock you up in jail, they don't hang you, they have a ceremony for you declaring that you're dead. And at that point, no one acknowledges that you exist. Your family stops talking to you, your friends stop talking to you. In fact, they'll walk right by you and not even acknowledge your presence. And Dr. Cannon studied these people and found that almost invariably within 2 weeks, these otherwise healthy people died. And when he studied them, he found that during this period, they were in a very high state of stress and anxiety. Their heart rates were beating 120, 140 beats per minute. Their blood pressure was rising. They were pouring out tremendous amounts of stress hormones. And they basically died of this intense, unsustainable level of stress. He called this the stress response or the fight or flight response, and was really one of the first to teach that this was an adaptive response at one time of evolution, but becomes less adaptive at different stages. So that when we, maybe 25,000 years ago, were hiking through the jungle, and suddenly a cobra slithers across our pathway, we would instantly activate this fight or flight response. Our heart would start beating faster. We would start breathing deeper and taking in more oxygen. Our pupils would dilate to let in more light. Our lunch would no longer be receiving blood supply because the blood would be going to the muscles of our arms and our legs. Our sweat glands would start to perspire to cool off our body. Our minds would become hyper alert. And our adrenal glands would be pumping out adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol to rev our system up to deal with a very stressful situation. So this is the fight or flight response. It was very adaptive when we were in a predatory environment. We don't have as effective claws and teeth that a lot of the predators had, so we had to develop this response which, confronting that python or that saber-toothed cat, we would either run as quickly as we could to get out of that situation or pick up the nearest stick and fight, depending upon whether or not we thought we could win or not. The problem is that this is one of the most deeply wired survival mechanisms that we have, and we continue to activate this fight or flight response many times throughout our day and throughout our life. So that if I'm driving to give a lecture, I'm going a little bit over the speed limit, and suddenly in my rearview mirror I see the flashing lights of the California Highway Patrol, I instantly activate my fight or flight response. My heart starts beating faster, I start sweating, my pupils dilate, my stomach goes into a cramp because I'm taking all the blood supply away. But what do? I usually don't run, and I usually don't fight. I pull over to the side of the road, put this big smile on my face. Oh, I'm sorry, officer. I just got this call that the chief of police's mother is there with a little stroke. I was trying to get there as fast as I could. We suppress that experience. And we do it a lot. And we do it many times throughout the day. You're standing in the under 10 checkout line and the guy in front of you has 12 items in their basket. Your son brings you home his D on his algebra test. Somebody cuts you off on the highway. You have to wait